My mom's new boyfriend sued me and had her kick me out of the house my dad left me on my 16th birthday. But I hired a lawyer, and fake daddy told me something that made me cry. Hi Reddit. It's me, Ryan, and I need to get something off my chest. When my grandfather passed away, he left me something that meant everything to me. A cottage by the lake. It wasn't some fancy mansion, but it was ours. A cozy, two-story house with creaky wooden floors, a porch that smelled like pine in the summer, and a fireplace that crackled louder than it needed to. Most importantly, it was mine. Not my mom's. Not my stepdad's. Just mine. I was 10 when I inherited it, too young to understand why Grandpa made that choice. But looking back now, I think he knew something I didn't. For the first couple of years, the house sat mostly untouched. My mom, Laura, would take me there on weekends, but she always seemed uncomfortable, like she didn't belong. Then, when I was 12, Richard came into our lives. Richard wasn't just another guy my mom was dating. He was the guy. He was charming, confident, always had the right thing to say. He owned a small construction business and talked about houses like they were piles of money waiting to be cashed in. And the moment he laid eyes on my house, I could see it in his face. It wasn't admiration. It wasn't appreciation. It was calculation. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. He made my mom happy, after all. He took her out to nice restaurants, bought her jewelry she never used to wear, and told her she deserved a real home, which always felt like a dig at our quiet, simple life. Still, I tried to be polite. When Richard moved in with us after just 6 months, I kept my mouth shut. When he started making subtle changes around our apartment, moving furniture, replacing decorations, I ignored the nagging feeling in my gut. Then, one day, Mom suggested we take Richard to see the house. I didn't want to, but what was I supposed to say? No, because I'm afraid he's going to try and take it? That would sound crazy. So I said yes. We drove out to Lakeshore Point on a Saturday morning, the air crisp and cool. As we pulled up the long dirt driveway, I glanced at Richard in the rearview mirror. He was quiet, eyes scanning the house like he was appraising it. The moment we stepped inside, he started making comments. The floors need refinishing. The kitchen is outdated. The whole layout could be improved. My hands clenched into fists. It wasn't even his house, and he was already acting like it was his project. Mom, of course, didn't see it. She just laughed and said, "Ryan, wouldn't it be nice if we fixed it up a little? Made it more comfortable?" For who? I kept my mouth shut. But after that trip, everything changed. Richard suddenly had a lot of opinions about the house. He talked about renovations, about how the property was wasted potential. He said we should make it work for us. That was the first time I felt genuinely afraid. Then, things started disappearing. First, it was Grandpa's old fishing gear, the set he used to take me out on the lake with. When I asked Mom where it went, she said Richard had cleaned up the shed and gotten rid of the junk. Next, it was the garden gate. Grandpa had built it himself, carving little patterns into the wood. One weekend, I came back, and it was gone. "It was falling apart," Richard said casually. "I'll build a new one." Spoiler, he never did. I started to realize this wasn't just about renovations. Richard wasn't just trying to change the house. He was trying to erase Grandpa from it. When I was 14, I overheard a conversation that made my stomach drop. It was late, maybe midnight, and I couldn't sleep. As I walked past the living room, I heard Richard on the phone, talking in a hushed voice. Yeah, I know. But we need the papers first." Pause. "No, she doesn't suspect anything." I stood there, heart pounding. Papers? Who didn't suspect anything? I crept closer, careful to avoid the squeaky floorboards. "Can't do anything until we have proof of ownership." Ownership. A wave of nausea rolled over me. Was he talking about my house? I leaned in just a little more, and then the floorboard creaked. Richard immediately went silent. A second later, he turned the corner, phone still in hand. When he saw me, he gave me that smile, the one that never quite reached his eyes. "What are you doing up, kid?" I forced my face to stay neutral. "Just getting water." He nodded, watching me too closely. "Go on then. It's late." I didn't move right away. Instead, I asked, "What were you talking about?" His smile never wavered. "Just business." I swallowed hard. "What kind of business?" Richard exhaled, finally putting his phone away. "Listen, Ryan. There are a lot of complicated things when it comes to homeownership. Your grandpa left us a great property, but we need to make sure everything is handled properly." Again, my stomach turned. That night, I lay awake for hours, my mind racing. Richard was up to something, I just didn't know what. But I had a feeling whatever it wasn't in my favor. And I was right, 'cause what I didn't know, Richard wasn't just planning to renovate my house. He was planning to steal it. For weeks after I overheard Richard's late-night phone call, I felt like I was living in a different reality than my mother. She still looked at him like he had saved us. I, on the other hand, had started paying attention. I noticed how Richard kept finding excuses to visit the house at Lakeshore Point. At first, it was under the guise of checking on things, but soon he was bringing people with him. Contractors, appraisers, even some guy with a clipboard who took photos and jotted down notes. When I asked my mom why, she waved it off. "Richard has experience with these things. He's just making sure the place is in good shape, right?" Because random men with clipboards scream casual maintenance. Something was happening, and I was determined to find out exactly what. One afternoon, I got my chance. Richard had left his work bag on the kitchen counter while he and Mom were out grocery shopping. My heart was pounding, but I knew I needed to look. I unzipped the bag and rifled through folders, loose receipts, and an overpriced cologne bottle. But then, I found an envelope. It had my house's address printed on it, along with the name of a law firm. My stomach twisted as I pulled out the papers inside. The first one was a property valuation. The second, a draft contract. For sale. I had to read it twice before it fully hit me. Richard was preparing to sell my house. Without telling me. Without telling my mom. I shoved everything back, zipped up the bag, and sat there, hands shaking. This wasn't just paranoia anymore. This was real. Richard wasn't just renovating my house. He was trying to take it from me. That night at dinner, I couldn't look at him without feeling like I was going to explode. Every time he spoke, every time he laughed, I clenched my fists under the table. Then, he said something that pushed me over the edge. "So, Ryan," he said, cutting into his steak like we were in some normal family dinner. "You're almost 17 now. You ever thought about getting a job?" I blinked. "A job?" Richard nodded. "Yeah, contributing. You're not a little kid anymore. If you're going to be living in that house, maybe it's time you start helping out." My blood boiled. Mom, my own mother, nodded along. "Richard has a point, honey. Maybe it's time we talked about expenses." Expenses? For my own house. I stared at them, barely keeping my voice steady. "Are you saying I should be paying rent?" Richard shrugged, his smirk too satisfied. "It's only fair. I mean, we've been handling all the bills for years now." Handling what bills? The house was paid off. My grandfather had made sure of that. Mom hesitated. "Ryan, we're not saying you should pay a lot, just something small. Maybe a few hundred a month." I turned to Richard. "How much?" His smirk widened. "$1, $500 a month." I laughed, like an actual disbelieving laugh. $1,500. Are you insane? Richard leaned back, sipping his wine like he was entitled to this conversation. "Ryan, it's a big house, a beautiful location. If you don't want to contribute, maybe it's time we consider other options." Other options, like selling it. That was his endgame. I turned to my mom, praying she would see this for what it was. "Mom, this isn't about helping out. He's trying to push me out." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "Ryan, that's not fair. Richard has done so much for us." That was when I snapped. I pushed back my chair, stood up, and looked right at Richard. "You want rent," I said, my voice deadly calm. "Fine. But if I have to pay rent, so do you." Richard's smirk dropped. "Excuse me?" I folded my arms. "This house belongs to me, not you, not Mom. Me. And if I have to contribute, then so do you." $2,500 a month. Starting next month. The room went silent. Mom gasped. Ryan, you can't. I can. I cut in. And I will. Because legally, this isn't his house. Richard's face turned an ugly shade of red. You little brat, he hissed, standing up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. You think just because your grandpa left it to you, you can lord it over us? I don't think, I said, staring him down. I know. For the first time in 5 years, Richard had no comeback. Mom was speechless. And for the first time ever, I felt like I had the upper hand. The battle lines are drawn. For a long moment no one moved. The dining room was thick with tension, so dense it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Richard, still standing, was gripping the back of his chair so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. His usual smug smirk was gone. Instead, his face was twisted into something raw, anger, disbelief, and just a hint of panic. Mom looked just as shocked. She kept darting her gaze between us like she couldn't decide whose side to take. Finally, Richard spoke. This is ridiculous. His voice was low and dangerous, like he was barely keeping his temper in check. I'm the one who's been keeping this house afloat. I let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Keeping it afloat? The house is paid off. Grandpa made sure of that. You're not handling anything, Richard. You're just waiting. Waiting until you can find a way to take it from me. Mom's fork clattered against her plate. Ryan, that's not fair. It's not fair. I cut her off, turning to her. Mom, I've been watching him. He's been snooping through Grandpa's paperwork, bringing in appraisers, and now he suddenly thinks I should pay $1,500 a month to live in my own house? And you think that's fair? Her lips parted, but no words came out. Because deep down I knew. She saw it too. She just didn't want to admit it. Richard pushed his chair back, straightening up. He exhaled sharply through his nose and rolled his shoulders, as if trying to regain control. His usual confidence was creeping back in. You're just a kid, he said, voice smooth again. You don't understand how the real world works. Houses come with expenses, property taxes, maintenance costs. I know exactly how it works, I interrupted. And I also know you're full of shit. Richard's jaw tightened. I could tell he wasn't used to me pushing back like this. Before, I was just the annoying teenager who got in his way. Now, I was the one thing standing between him and the house. Mom rubbed her temples. This is getting out of hand. We need to talk about this calmly. There's nothing to talk about, I said, still staring Richard down. I'm not paying rent. And if that's really the new rule, then Richard can start paying $2,500 a month since he's been living here for free all these years. Richard's smirk returned, but this time it was different. Calculated. You think you're clever, don't you? He said, folding his arms. All right, fine. Let's talk about ownership then. He turned to my mom, voice suddenly gentle, like he was some loving husband instead of the snake I knew he was. Laura, sweetheart, don't you think it's a little strange? Ryan's a kid, yet he owns an entire property. He doesn't even have a job. His eyes flicked back to me. You should be grateful that I've been taking care of things all these years. My stomach turned cold. This wasn't just about rent. He was laying the groundwork for something bigger. And I was right, because 2 weeks later I got served with legal papers. Richard goes on the attack. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. I was in the living room, scrolling through my phone, when the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, a woman in a stiff black blazer stood there, holding an envelope. Ryan Carter? She asked. I nodded. She handed me the envelope. You've been served. I just stared at her. My brain refused to process what was happening. What? She sighed, clearly used to people reacting like this. Your stepfather, Richard Bennett, is contesting your inheritance. He's claiming financial contributions and seeking a legal claim to the house. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. You're kidding. The woman gave me a pitying look. I'd suggest getting a lawyer. You're going to need one. She walked away, leaving me frozen in the doorway. I forced myself to tear open the envelope, scanning the pages with shaking hands. Richard's name was all over it. He was claiming that, since he had financially supported the household for years, he had a legal right to part of the house. That Grandpa's will didn't account for household expenses, and that, in reality, Mom and Richard were the rightful owners. I wanted to throw up. I stormed inside, my heart pounding in my ears, and slammed the papers onto the kitchen table. "Mom!" She came rushing in, startled by my tone. "Ryan, what?" I pointed at the papers. "Explain this." Her eyes widened as she skimmed the documents. "Oh my God!" I crossed my arms. "Did you know about this?" She shook her head. "No, Ryan. I swear. I had no idea Richard was doing this." A lump of rage swelled in my throat. "Are you seriously telling me you didn't see this coming?" She looked genuinely panicked. "He never mentioned anything about this, I promise. I thought he just wanted you to contribute a little. I never thought he'd try to take the house." Just then, the front door swung open, and in walked Richard, looking pleased with himself. I turned on him instantly. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, holding up the papers. Richard didn't even flinch. "It's called protecting our assets, Ryan." He set his keys down like this was just another normal day. "Your mother and I have been the ones managing this household. It's only fair that we establish what's legally ours." I could barely breathe. "You think this house is yours?" His expression darkened. "Ryan, you don't have a job. You don't pay bills. Do you really think a teenager should be in charge of an entire property?" I saw red. "My grandfather left me this house. Not Mom. Not you. Me. You have no claim to it." Richard smirked. "We'll see what the court thinks about that." I clenched my fists so hard my nails dug into my palms. "You're a thief." "Ryan, enough," Mom pleaded. But I wasn't backing down. I stepped closer, voice low and full of rage. "You can throw all the legal papers you want, Richard, but I will fight you for this house. I will get a lawyer, and I will bury you in court." For a split second, I saw something flicker in Richard's eyes. Doubt. But then he just smirked again. "Better start saving up, then." With that, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me shaking with rage. I turned to Mom. "You cannot defend him after this." Tears filled her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never thought he'd go this far." I took a deep breath. Then another. "Mom," I said, voice steady. "If you don't stand with me, you stand with him." She wiped her eyes. Then slowly she nodded. The house was silent after Richard walked out, but the weight of what had just happened pressed down on me like a tidal wave. My own stepfather was suing me, trying to steal my house. My hands were still shaking as I sat down, staring at the legal papers on the table. It felt surreal, like I was in some twisted nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. Mom was still standing near the kitchen counter, wiping at her eyes. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, like the weight of what Richard had done had finally hit her. I should have felt some relief that she was finally seeing the truth, but all I felt was rage. I took a slow, deep breath and looked at her. "Mom," she sniffled, meeting my eyes. "I need to know something," I said. My voice was steady, but my body was tense, like a bowstring pulled too tight. "Are you still on his side?" Her eyes widened. "Ryan, of course not. Because if you are—" I cut in, my jaw clenching. "I need to know right now." She wiped at her face, shaking her head. "I swear to you, I had no idea he was going to do this. If I had—" She trailed off, like she couldn't even bring herself to finish the sentence. I studied her face carefully, looking for any hesitation. I didn't see any. I exhaled slowly. "Then you need to prove it." She blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, if you're really on my side, you're going to help me fight him." I expected her to hesitate, to look uncomfortable, to make excuses. But she didn't. She squared her shoulders, nodding. "Tell me what to do." And just like that, for the first time in years, it felt like my mom was choosing me. The next morning, I called the only person I knew I could trust. Uncle David. David was my grandfather's younger brother, and he had never liked Richard. Every holiday, he'd throw thinly veiled insults at him, calling him a slick salesman, and a man with too many opinions and not enough integrity. He answered on the second ring. "Ryan, everything okay? I didn't waste time. Richard is trying to steal my house." There was silence on the line. Then a slow, measured, "Tell me everything." I laid it all out, the rent scheme, the appraisers, the legal claim Richard had filed against me. By the time I was done, David's voice had dropped into something cold and dangerous. "That son of a bitch." I let out a humorless laugh. "Yeah, that about sums it up." "Listen to me," David said firmly. "You need a lawyer, and not just any lawyer. You need a real bastard who will make Richard wish he never even thought about this." "I don't even know where to start," I admitted, running a hand through my hair. "I do." David hung up. Less than 3 hours later, I got a call from a woman named Margaret Holloway. Margaret was in her late 40s, with a sharp voice and an even sharper reputation. When I picked up the phone, she got straight to the point. "Ryan, I just got off the phone with your uncle. He says your stepfather is trying to take what isn't his." "That's right." "Well," she said, "I love making men like him miserable." I liked her immediately. Margaret agreed to meet us at the house that evening. When she arrived, she took one look at Richard's legal claim and let out a dry, amused chuckle. "This is a joke." She flipped through the pages. "He's claiming financial contributions as justification for ownership? Does he have any documentation proving he actually paid for anything?" I shook my head. "No, because he hasn't." Margaret smirked. "Then this case isn't going to last 5 minutes in court." I felt a flicker of hope. "So, he doesn't have a case?" "Oh, he has a case," she said. "It's just a bad one. The problem is, people like Richard don't care about winning. They care about dragging things out, making you so miserable that you give up just to make it stop." I clenched my fists. "I'm not giving up." Margaret nodded approvingly. "Good. Then let's get to work." For the next week, I barely slept. Margaret dug up everything. Grandpa's will, property tax records, mortgage statements proving that the house had been paid off before Richard even met my mother. Meanwhile, I started documenting everything. Every time Richard made a passive-aggressive comment, written down. Every time he tried to intimidate me, noted. Every little thing he had taken from the house and forgotten to replace, listed. Richard, for his part, pretended nothing was happening. When I passed him in the hallway, he'd smirk, like he knew something I didn't. One morning, he even had the audacity to whistle while making coffee, like he hadn't just tried to legally kick me out of my own home. I wanted to punch him, but I knew losing my temper was exactly what he wanted. The first time Richard realized he was in trouble was when a courier arrived with our counterclaim. I was in the kitchen when it happened. Richard was lounging on the couch, sipping his usual overpriced coffee, when the doorbell rang. I didn't move. I wanted him to get it. When he opened the door, I heard a short conversation. A professional, clipped voice saying, "Legal documents for Mr. Richard Bennett." Then the door shut. Silence. Then, "Ryan." I smirked. "Here we go." Richard stormed into the kitchen, waving the envelope like it was a personal insult. "What the hell is this?" I leaned back in my chair. "That, Richard, is a legal response to your bullshit." He ripped open the envelope, scanning the documents. His face darkened. "You got a lawyer?" I crossed my arms. "Not just any lawyer. A damn good one." His jaw tightened as he flipped through the pages. I saw the exact moment he realized that I had evidence, that I wasn't just some stupid kid he could push around. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. I stood up, stepping closer. "I know it does." We stood there, staring each other down. And for the first time in years, I saw something in Richard's face that I had never seen before. Fear. He turned without another word and stormed upstairs. Mom exhaled shakily. "Ryan, what happens now?" I clenched my fists. "Now?" I looked toward the staircase, where Richard had disappeared. "Now we take him down." After Richard stormed upstairs, I stood there for a long moment, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. For the first time, he was scared. But I knew Richard. He wouldn't go down without a fight. Mom sank into a chair, rubbing her temples. I can't believe this is happening. I exhaled sharply. Believe it, Mom. Because Richard is not stopping until he gets what he wants. She looked at me, her face lined with exhaustion. Ryan, I know I've made mistakes. I should have seen this sooner. But, her voice wavered. But I never thought he'd try to take the house from you. I folded my arms. He never cared about us, Mom. He cared about this house. She closed her eyes for a moment before nodding. There was a long silence. Then I said, we need to get ahead of him. Mom looked up. What do you mean? I pushed the legal papers toward her. Margaret said Richard is going to try and drag this out. Make it expensive. Make it exhausting. Mom swallowed hard. We don't have that kind of money. I clenched my fists. Exactly. Which means we need to make him quit before it even gets to court. Her eyes widened. How? I looked up toward the staircase. Richard had skeletons. I just had to find them. The next day, I called Lisa, my cousin, and quite possibly the only person on this planet more stubborn than I am. She showed up within the hour, armed with her laptop and 2 iced coffees. So, she said, dropping onto the couch, we're ruining Richard's life today? Hopefully. She grinned. Love that for us. Lisa had always hated Richard. She'd called him a gold digger since the day he moved in, and she never let Mom forget it. What's the plan? She asked, cracking her knuckles. I exhaled. Richard has been married twice before. Lisa's eyebrows shot up. 2 ex-wives. Yep. I leaned forward. And both of them lost their houses after their divorces. Lisa's eyes sparkled with mischief. Ryan, are you thinking what I'm thinking? We find them, I said. And we find out exactly how he screwed them over. Lisa rubbed her hands together. Oh, this is going to be fun. She pulled out her laptop and got to work. Took 2 hours, but eventually Lisa hit gold. Got him, she said triumphantly, spinning the laptop toward me. On the screen were 2 names, Rachel Meyer and Sophia Lynn. Rachel had been married to Richard 10 years ago. They'd bought a house together, and within 2 years, Richard had forced her to sell it, walking away with half the money. Sophia had been his next wife. Same story, different house. Lisa whistled. This guy is like a real estate parasite. I grabbed my phone. I need to talk to them. Lisa smirked. Already ahead of you. Rachel still lives in the city. And guess what? What? She's on Facebook. I stared at Lisa, then at the screen. Richard's first ex-wife was 1 message away. I didn't hesitate. I clicked send. Rachel replied 3 hours later. At first, she was hesitant. But when I told her Richard was trying to steal my house, she agreed to meet. The next afternoon, I met her at a small cafe. Rachel was in her late 40s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. The moment she sat down, she looked me over and said, So, Richard's still pulling the same tricks. I nodded. Tell me everything. She exhaled, stirring her coffee. He's a manipulator. He makes you feel like you're crazy for questioning him. He convinces you that he knows best, and before you know it, your name is off the deed, and he's walking away with your house. I clenched my fists. How did he do it? Rachel's lips pressed together. Slowly. He started with small changes, pushing for joint ownership, saying it was only fair. Then he convinced me to sell, promising we'd buy something better together. She let out a bitter laugh. Except the new house? He put it under his name only. And once the money was gone, so was he. I exhaled sharply. And Sophia? Did he do the same thing to her? Rachel nodded. Worse. She had family money. He bled her dry before leaving. My blood boiled. Rachel studied me for a long moment. You're not going to let him win, are you? I shook my head. Never. She smiled. Good. Because I'd love to help. My eyebrows lifted. You would. Oh, honey. She leaned back in her chair. I have bank statements, emails, even old voicemails from Richard pressuring me to sell. If you want to prove he has a pattern of this. I've got your smoking gun. I felt my heart kickstart. Rachel, I said slowly, you might have just saved my house. That night, Margaret nearly kissed me when I handed over Rachel's files. This, she said, flipping through the evidence, is a nightmare for Richard. I smirked. Good. The next day, Margaret had Richard served with a new set of legal documents. We weren't just defending the case anymore. We were accusing him of fraudulent intent. The moment Richard saw the papers, he lost his mind. He slammed them on the table, turning to me with pure rage. Where did you get this? He snarled. I folded my arms. Say hi to Rachel for me. His face drained of color. And in that moment I knew he was screwed. Richard was good at lying. Good at manipulating. But he wasn't good at losing. And now, he was finally on the losing side. Richard stood there, gripping the legal papers with shaking hands. I had never seen him look so caught off guard. For years, he had been the one with the upper hand, pulling strings behind the scenes while my mother and I blindly played along. But now, the game had changed. You talked to Rachel, he said, voice dangerously low. I folded my arms, keeping my expression calm. And Sophia. His jaw tightened. I let that sink in. He knew exactly what that meant. For the first time, Richard wasn't in control. Mom stood in the corner, wringing her hands. She looked between Richard and me like she wasn't sure what to believe. Ryan, she said cautiously. What exactly is this? I turned to her. It's proof, Mom. Proof that Richard has done this before. He's taken houses from other women, and now he's trying to do it again. Richard laughed, shaking his head. Laura, come on. You're not seriously buying into this. Shut up. The words came out sharp, cutting through the tension like a blade. Took me a second to realize they hadn't come from me. They had come from Mom. Richard's face froze. What? Mom took a step forward, her hands no longer shaking. I said, shut up, Richard. Her voice was firm, steady, stronger than I'd heard it in years. I want to hear what Ryan has to say. Richard blinked. He looked at her like he didn't recognize her. Neither did I, honestly. For years, Mom had defended him, dismissed my concerns, begged me to give him a chance. But now she was looking at him differently, like she was finally seeing him. I turned to her. Mom, Richard was never here for us. He was here for this house. He's been planning this for years. He pushed me to pay rent so I'd get used to the idea that I wasn't the rightful owner. He told you we needed renovations. But really, he was setting up an excuse to take control. Mom's breathing was uneven. I could tell she was piecing it together. And then, the final blow. I handed her Rachel's file. Everything you need to know is in here, I said quietly. Emails, bank statements, voicemails. I swallowed hard. Mom, he did this to 2 other women. And now he's doing it to you. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the papers. Then I watched it happen. I watched realization sink in. Her face changed, eyes widening, mouth slightly open. Betrayal hitting her like a tidal wave. Richard, she whispered, looking up at him. For the first time since I had known him, Richard looked nervous. Laura, listen to me. No, her voice broke. She shook her head, stepping back like she couldn't bear to be near him. I believed you. I defended you. I let you talk me into things because I thought you cared about us. About me. She let out a bitter laugh. But you never did you? Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. Because what could he say? Mom turned to me. Ryan, what do we do now? I took a deep breath. We get him out of our lives. The next day, Richard moved out of the bedroom. I thought that meant he was packing his bags. I was wrong. Instead of leaving, he doubled down. He started slamming doors when he walked through the house. He blasted music late at night to keep me from sleeping. He left dirty dishes everywhere, refusing to clean up after himself. He wasn't just staying, he was making our lives hell. One morning, I woke up to find my bike missing from the garage. When I asked Richard about it, he just shrugged. Maybe you should have locked it up better. I clenched my fists. The next night, the Wi-Fi mysteriously stopped working. When I checked the router, I found that someone had unplugged it and locked the cable box. Classic Richard. Mom was exhausted. I could see it in her face. The stress, the guilt, the weight of realizing she had let this man into our home. "He's doing this on purpose?" she muttered one night, rubbing her temples. "He's trying to make us miserable so we'll cave." I exhaled sharply. "We won't." But the truth? I wasn't sure how much more of this I could take. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, they did. 2 days later, Margaret called me. "Ryan, I need you to come to my office. Now." Her tone was urgent. I didn't hesitate. When I got there, she had a stack of new legal papers on her desk. "This just came in," she said, sliding them toward me. "Richard isn't just fighting for ownership anymore. He's suing you for damages." I froze. "What?" "He's claiming that he's invested over $75,000 into the house, and that he's owed financial compensation." I let out a sharp laugh. 75 grand? He hasn't spent a dime. Margaret nodded. "Exactly. He's lying. But proving that in court is going to take time. And money." My stomach sank. That was exactly what he wanted. He knew I couldn't afford a long legal battle. He was dragging this out on purpose. I clenched my jaw. "So what do we do?" Margaret leaned forward. "We make him quit before it gets that far." I frowned. "How?" Her eyes gleamed. "We turn the tables. The plan to destroy Richard." Margaret explained it like this. 1. Expose Richard's financial lies. If he was claiming he spent $75,000, we were going to demand receipts. He wouldn't have them because they didn't exist. 2. Make his past public. Rachel had already agreed to testify if this went to court. And if we could get Sophia to back us up, Richard would be walking in with a stained reputation. 3. Offer him an exit with conditions. Richard wanted money? Fine. We'd make an offer. He drops all claims to the house, and in return we won't sue him for fraud. If he refused, we'd drag him through court and ruin his life. Margaret smirked. Men like Richard don't actually want to fight. They just want to win. And when they realize they can't, she leaned back in her chair. They cut and run. I stared at her. For the first time since this nightmare started, I felt like I was in control. I nodded. "Let's do it." Margaret grinned. "Buckle up, kid. It's about to get fun. The beginning of the end." That night, when I got home, I passed Richard in the hallway. He gave me a smug, condescending look. "You should start packing," he said. "You won't be here much longer." I smiled. "No, Richard," I said, voice calm and confident. "You won't." Richard was still standing in the hallway, smirking like he thought he had already won. That smirk used to get to me. But now I saw it for what it was, a mask. A desperate cover for a man who was starting to realize he wasn't as smart as he thought he was. He didn't know it yet, but the game was already over, and I was about to bury him. The next morning, Margaret launched phase 1 of our plan. She sent Richard's lawyer a formal demand for proof of the $75,000 he claimed to have spent on the house. We weren't asking politely. We were demanding receipts for renovations, bank statements showing payments, invoices from contractors. I already knew he didn't have them, because there were none. For 2 days, Richard pretended not to care. He strutted around the house, making little snide remarks whenever I passed by. "You're wasting your time," he sneered one morning over breakfast. "Courts don't side with kids, Ryan. You're going to lose." I took a sip of my coffee and didn't react, because I knew something he didn't. I knew that Margaret had already spoken to his previous lawyer. And guess what? Richard had pulled the same stunt before. 2 years ago, he tried to sue Rachel, the first ex-wife, for unpaid contributions. The case was laughed out of court when he couldn't provide a single shred of evidence. And now he was walking into the same trap. On the 3rd day, Richard's mood shifted. His lawyer must have told him what Margaret already knew. His claim was falling apart. That night, as I was walking upstairs, I heard his voice in my mother's room. Low, urgent. I slowed down, listening. "Laura, listen to me," Richard said. "This is our house. I don't know what Ryan has told you, but he's trying to turn you against me. There was a pause. Then, no, Richard, Mom said, her voice cold. You did that all by yourself. Silence. I smirked. Good. Richard didn't know it yet, but his worst day was about to happen. Because Margaret was a genius. She had arranged a formal deposition, meaning Richard would have to show up in person and answer questions, under oath. And that's when the real fun began. The day of the deposition, I sat beside Margaret in the conference room, waiting. Mom was there too, pale but determined. She wanted to hear everything. Richard finally arrived, looking less smug than usual. His lawyer sat beside him, flipping through paperwork. Margaret wasted no time. She leaned forward, folding her hands neatly. Mr. Bennett, let's talk about your financial contributions to the house. Richard sat up straighter, trying to look confident. Of course. Margaret slid a paper across the table. Can you identify this? Richard glanced at it, frowning. Looks like a credit report. It is, Margaret confirmed. It's yours. And according to this, you have less than $400 in your checking account. Mom stiffened beside me. Richard shifted uncomfortably. That's irrelevant. Margaret smiled. Actually, it's extremely relevant. Because you're claiming you spent $75,000 on home expenses, but your own bank statements show 0 transactions related to this property. Richard's face turned red. Margaret didn't stop. In fact, she continued, your tax records show that you reported 0 home improvement expenses for the last 5 years. She tilted her head. Can you explain that? Richard's jaw tightened. I paid in cash. Margaret feigned surprise. Really? So, you withdrew $75,000 in cash over 5 years. Ah. She slid another paper forward. Because your withdrawal records show that the most you've ever taken out at once is $200. Silence. Dead. Silence. Richard sputtered. I must have used different accounts. Margaret leaned back, looking absolutely thrilled. Oh? Then please provide those bank records. I'd love to see them. Richard's lawyer cleared his throat. We'll need time to. We can wait, Margaret said sweetly. More silence. Then, Richard's lawyer sighed and muttered, no further questions. I wanted to cheer, because in that moment we all knew Richard had lost. That night, back at the house, Richard was furious. He slammed doors, muttered under his breath, and tried one last time to scare me. You think you're so smart, he spat as I walked past him. But this isn't over. I stopped and turned. Yeah, Richard, actually, it is. His fists clenched. You ruined my life. I laughed. You did that all by yourself. And then, finally, Richard packed his bags. Mom served him an eviction notice, and Margaret made sure he had 0 claim to the house. And just like that, Richard was gone. The first morning without Richard in the house was weirdly quiet. No slamming doors. No passive-aggressive remarks. No stress hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Mom sat across from me at the kitchen table, staring at her coffee. I can't believe he's really gone, she whispered. I exhaled, feeling lighter than I had in years. I can. She looked up at me. Ryan, I'm so sorry. I held her gaze. I know. And for the first time in a long time, I believed her. A few months later, I got a letter from Rachel. It was short and simple. You did what I couldn't. I hope you enjoy your house, kid. You earned it. I smiled, because she was right. I did earn it. And no one, not Richard, not anyone, was ever taking it away from me again. The first few days after Richard was gone felt surreal. For years, he had made this house feel like a war zone, filling it with his presence, his voice, his manipulation. And now, silence. It was the kind of silence I hadn't experienced in a long time. No slamming doors. No passive-aggressive sighs. No muttered insults under his breath when he thought I couldn't hear him. It was just me and Mom, sitting at the kitchen table, both of us trying to figure out what life was supposed to look like now. On the third morning, I woke up to the smell of pancakes. I walked into the kitchen, half expecting to see someone else there, because my mother never made pancakes. That had always been Grandpa's thing. But there she was, flipping a golden stack on the griddle, looking tired, older than she had a few months ago. She glanced up when I walked in and gave me a small, uncertain smile. "I thought maybe we could sit down and eat together," she said. I sat at the table, watching as she carefully placed a plate in front of me. I wasn't sure what to say. After a long silence, Mom sighed and rubbed her hands over her face. "Ryan," she started, "I need to talk to you." I braced myself. "I let you down," she said, voice thick with emotion. "For years, I let Richard walk all over this family. I let him make decisions, push you around, and I believed him." She swallowed hard. "I believed him over you." I stared at my plate. 'Cause yeah, I had thought about that. A lot. All the times I had told her something was wrong, and she had waved it away. All the times she had sided with him, ignoring the way he talked down to me, the way he chipped away at my confidence. And now she was finally seeing it. "I should have protected you," she whispered. "But instead, you had to protect me." I exhaled slowly, gripping my fork. "Yeah," I said honestly. "You should have." She flinched but didn't look away. "I can't change what I did," she admitted. "But I need you to know. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Because for the first time in years, I believed her. I gave her a small nod. "Okay." Her eyes welled with tears. But this time I didn't feel guilty about it. She needed to sit with this. She needed to feel it. And I needed to let her. The next few weeks were dedicated to erasing Richard. I started with his leftovers. His stupid protein powder? Trashed. His ugly leather jacket in the hallway closet? Burned. The expensive cologne he left behind? Poured down the sink. It felt therapeutic. But the real change happened when I started fixing what Richard had destroyed. First, I rebuilt the garden gate he had torn down years ago. I carved the same patterns into it that Grandpa once had, feeling a weird sense of peace as I worked. Then I repainted the porch swing, the one he had promised to replace but never did. Mom helped. She didn't say much, but she stayed outside with me for hours, sanding, painting, fixing. It was her way of apologizing. And for the first time, our house started feeling like home again. One afternoon, a letter arrived for me. I knew the handwriting instantly. It was from Rachel. Inside was a short note. "Ryan, you did what I couldn't. I hope you enjoy your house, kid. You earned it. Rachel." And underneath it, a check for $5,000. I stared at it in shock before showing Mom. "She didn't have to do this," I said. Mom smiled. "No, but I think she wanted to. And maybe I would accept it." One evening, I found myself standing at the edge of the lake, watching the water ripple under the soft glow of the sunset. For years, this place had been my safe haven. And then, Richard had tried to take it from me. But he didn't win. I sat down on the old wooden dock and closed my eyes. For the first time in years, I felt at peace. This house was mine. It had always been mine. And now it was safe. For good. The weeks after Richard's departure felt like a slow exhale. A tension that had wrapped itself around my life for years was finally gone, leaving behind a strange quiet I wasn't used to. But the thing about getting rid of someone like Richard is that their damage lingers. Even though he was out of the house, his presence was still everywhere. The things he had thrown away, the things he had replaced, the things he had stolen, and the worst part, the things he had taken from me that weren't physical at all. So I decided, if I was going to move forward, I needed to start by taking back what was mine. The first real gut punch came when I walked into Grandpa's old study. Richard had always hated this room. It was small, tucked into the back of the house, filled with old books, wooden furniture, and framed photos of my grandfather's entire life. His fishing trips, his childhood, even his old military uniform folded neatly in a shadow box. At least that's what used to be there. Now the shelves were half empty. Books missing. Photos missing. Pieces of my family history erased. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. I had been so focused on saving the house that I hadn't let myself think about what had already been lost. And suddenly I was furious, because Richard might have lost the war, but this felt like a battle he had already won. I tore through the house, searching for anything Richard had taken. Some of Grandpa's things turned up in the attic, stuffed in old boxes like they were junk. Some were buried in Mom's closet, hidden away where Richard must have shoved them. But a lot of things, they were just gone. I stormed into the kitchen, where Mom was washing dishes, and slammed a box of Grandpa's old journals on the table. "These were in the attic," I said, my voice sharp. "Do you know what else he threw up there? Do you know what else is missing?" Mom flinched at my tone. "Ryan, I didn't—" she swallowed. "I didn't know he moved those." I ran a hand through my hair, pacing. "What else? The books? The pictures?" My voice cracked. "Mom, what did he do with them?" She went pale. And that's when I saw it, the guilt. "Ryan," she said softly, setting down the dish towel. "There's something I need to tell you." I stopped pacing. She hesitated. "A few months ago, before all of this, Richard started saying the house was too cluttered, that we needed to simplify." My stomach dropped. "I didn't think anything of it at the time," she continued. "He said he was just donating old things we didn't need." She gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. "I didn't realize." She cut herself off, but she didn't need to finish, because I already knew exactly what she was about to say. I took a shaky breath. "He threw away Grandpa's things." She squeezed her eyes shut. "Yes." I felt sick. "Ryan," she whispered, stepping closer. "I'm so sorry. If I had known, I would have stopped him. I swear." I took a step back. I wasn't ready to hear her apologies, because right now all I could think about was the fact that Grandpa's history, the pieces of his life that he had left behind, were probably sitting in a landfill somewhere, gone forever, and it was Richard's fault. I spent the next week hunting down whatever I could. I called every thrift store in town, asking if they had received any donations matching Grandpa's things. Most said no. Some said yes, but the items had already been sold. One store said they remembered an old clock, but it had been taken by a collector who came in once a month looking for antiques. I asked for his name. The store owner hesitated but eventually gave it to me. His name was Daniel Cole. And if he had Grandpa's clock, I was going to get it back. Lisa, because of course she was involved by this point, insisted on coming with me when I tracked down Daniel's address. "This is the most dramatic thing you've ever done," she said as we pulled up to his house. "And I love it." I rolled my eyes. "Just don't say anything weird, okay?" Lisa did not promise that. We knocked on the door, and a tall man in his 60s answered. His house was filled with antiques, shelves lined with old books and delicate trinkets. "Can I help you?" he asked, eyeing us warily. I took a deep breath. "Hi, Mr. Cole. My name is Ryan. I think you might have bought something that was stolen from my family." His eyebrows shot up. "Stolen?" I nodded. "A wooden clock. Handmade. It belonged to my grandfather." Daniel crossed his arms. "I don't buy stolen goods." "I know," I said quickly. "You didn't know. But it was taken from my home without my permission. And if you have it, I'd really love to buy it back." Daniel studied me for a long moment. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into his house. Lisa and I exchanged a glance. Seconds later, he came back holding Grandpa's clock. I felt my chest tighten. It looked exactly the same, polished wood, engraved initials on the side. Daniel sighed. "I paid $200 for it." I pulled out $300 in cash. "I'll pay you more." He shook his head and pushed my money away. "Keep it, kid," he said. "Take the clock." I blinked. "Wait, really?" Daniel nodded. "Some things don't belong to strangers." I swallowed hard, holding the clock like it was the most valuable thing in the world. Maybe it was. That night, I placed the clock back in Grandpa's study, right where it used to be. And for the first time in years, it felt like I had finally taken something back. I sat down on the floor, listening to the steady ticking, feeling the weight of everything settle around me. Richard had stolen a lot from me. But not this. Not anymore. The house felt different now. For the first time in years, I could walk through it without feeling like I had to defend it. Without feeling like someone was lurking in the background, waiting to take it away. Without feeling like I was a guest in my own home. Richard was gone. And after weeks of reclaiming what was mine, repairing, replacing, rebuilding, I finally felt like I could breathe again. One afternoon, as I was sweeping dust off the front porch, Mom came outside with an envelope in her hands. She looked nervous. "What's that?" I asked, brushing my hair out of my face. She held it out. "It's from Richard's lawyer." I stiffened. "What?" She sighed, rubbing her forehead. "He's offering to settle." I took the envelope, ripping it open immediately. Inside was a letter outlining Richard's final offer. He was officially dropping his lawsuit and giving up any claim to the house. But he was also demanding $10,000 in compensation. I laughed. A sharp, disbelieving sound. Mom frowned. "Ryan, he thinks we owe him?" I scoffed, shaking my head. "After everything he did? He's lucky we're not suing him for fraud." Mom hesitated. "Margaret said we could counter with a lower amount just to get rid of him for good." I clenched my jaw, reading over the letter again. And then, I grabbed a pen and scrawled one word at the bottom of the page. "Declined." Mom sucked in a breath. "Ryan." "No," I shook my head, my voice firm. "Not a penny. He gets nothing. Because Richard had already taken too much from us. And I refused to give him anything else." A few weeks later, I was walking downtown when I saw him. Richard. He was sitting alone at an outdoor cafe, hunched over his phone, looking stressed. His hair was thinner, his face was drawn, and for the first time ever, he didn't look powerful. He looked small. He must have felt me staring because he glanced up. For a long second, we just stared at each other. Then he gave me a tight, bitter smile. "Enjoy your house," he said. And for once, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel like I had to fight. I just smirked. "I will." Then I turned and walked away, leaving him behind for good. That night, I sat on the back porch, watching the lake. The sky was clear, the water calm, the stars reflecting in the ripples. And for the first time since Grandpa had died, I didn't feel like I was holding on to this house out of desperation. I wasn't just fighting to keep it anymore. I was finally ready to live in it. I ran my fingers over the wood of the porch swing, the same one I had rebuilt with Mom. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the familiar scent of pine and water. And I smiled, because this place, this was mine. It had always been mine. And no one, not Richard, not anyone, was ever taking it away from me again.